Yes, of course. The societies in previous days, traditional societies didn't need this amount of information as they need them now. So, citizens are individuals who are receiving huge amounts of data and information from each and every location. And if the media doesn't have this freedom or this space of freedom, this is reflected on the society as a whole. At the beginning, I would like to go back to the history of this freedom. It is attributed to probably the Human Rights Declaration in 48, which the United Nations entrenched and stipulated the need of protecting freedom of media, freedom of press, which is 100% related to the freedom of expression. And also within the convention, the UNESCO convention, it also highlighted the facilitation of information, whether by words or images, and this was even before the digital revolution that has added resources to the media. The freedom of media these days, there's a lot of the media sees itself as someone who is looking into specific issues or goes into linguistic dilemmas, scorning, or it goes out of all of the rules, the professional rules of media. What's most important is that media has to respect the professional rules, and that it wouldn't have individuals who come outsiders, and that the state as well preserves these codes. And I think here a French, Albert Londres, who said that our responsibility or duty is not to support an individual or to tell people what they want to hear, nor defame them. Our responsibility is to put the pen in the wound. And here the importance in constructing or building societies, the role of media. The developed countries all have freedom of press. The third world, or that has non-democratic regimes, they all live as well a phase of crippling freedoms, which live in a lot of peace, whether social peace. Those are the countries that consider media one of the pillars of democracy. Allow me to go back to development. The researchers have not been able to link fully between media and development accurately or in a calculated way. However, through linking between some of the issues inside the society, and to come up with the outcome that there is a direct relationship between the freedom of press and development, whether in health, because health culture in today's societies comes from the TV, the internet, and raising awareness, yes, of course. And this is where there is more linkage. The more education, the more aware the people become, the more they demand more information to benefit them in their daily life. Politics, everything is included, or everything falls back into politics, but the free media stands in between the ruler and the people, because it explains the public policies of different states and delivers the pains and sorrows of citizens to the ruler. And there's also the judiciary, who the state, the the media can also stand or confront judiciary, and they also talk about malpractices, requesting that they play their role, whatever this situation or the individuals or institutions that I apologize, but let's go back to this point in another aspect of the discussion, holding the media or the press accountable. Allow me please to go to Mr. Richard and ask you, sir. We always have an imagination in some of the societies that there are other societies that are more lucky than we are, or that there are societies who have an open limit or open ceiling for freedom, and that we are the people who are most suffering from the low ceiling of. Is this correct? Are there institutions or societies with open horizons of freedom?
At the bottom, rather unsurprisingly, is North Korea. So that's a list of 180 nations. My own country, Britain, has sunk to 40th place. And that's actually around all sorts of different restrictions that are put on the work of journalists in Britain. If you'll excuse me, I did make a few notes. I'll just outline a few to you. Journalists in Britain are subject to a wide range of legal restrictions which inhibit freedom of expression. I work as a journalist. I need to remember that we have the law of libel, Official Secrets Act, the anti-terrorism laws, we have the law of contempt in court cases, we have the law of confidence and the development of privacy laws, intellectual property laws, legislation regulating public order, trespass, harassment, anti-discrimination, and obscenity. Now, you might think that Britain, which probably has the oldest established press in the world, my own newspaper began publishing in 1791, you might think that Britain has a long history of a freedom of the press, but that's not true. The press has had to fight for many years for the rights that it has. And you may wonder, excellent, thank you very much. Someone's found the map that I was referring to earlier. Can I just talk about this map behind us, please, for a moment? Please? Sure. This is compiled by Reporters Without Borders, by writing to 180 different nations, asking media experts, journalists, lawyers, to fill in a questionnaire about the state of their nation when it comes to the media. And it's mostly, to be fair, actually around the treatment of journalists themselves in those particular countries. I'll quickly explain the key. Those countries coloured white are thought to be in a good situation. Those yellow, reasonably satisfactory. So Britain, my country, is reasonably satisfactory. There's a noticeable problem in those coloured orange. There's a difficult situation, frankly, in most of the world, as you will see, the red colour. And finally, there's a very serious situation in those nations coloured black. It won't escape your notice that several nations in this region are fairly low down the ranking. I think it's very easy to look at that and become alarmed. But I don't think you should, because, as I hope we're going to discuss here, there are cultural differences, many, many cultural differences that have to be taken into account when considering the freedom of the press. I come from Europe, where we have a much more irreverent view of public life, if you like. It's not considered to be insulting, to be really very rude about the head of state, to be really rather rude about the government. In other nations, that isn't possible. It's culturally different. So I think maybe we'll leave that up while we continue this discussion. Thank you.
والحقيقة طلب إن إحنا نسيبها شوية بس أنا حاسة إنها خطر على يعني.
So this is important for our well-being here, but however, each one of us has looked to at his country and seen and compares the situation of press there. Mr. Richard spoke about two important points: the different culture, and also that there's nothing called open ceiling, but there is a way or a code in each institution that is agreed to. Let me go back to Mr. Albert and talk about these institutions and how they look. There's something that was said by Mr. Bassam al-Baghdadi, and I quote, in freedom of speech, it is the right of saying what you want, and it's also the right of people to say what you do not like. To what extent do our institutions, are our institutions capable of accepting that? And here I apologize, but allow me to say the beginning of the answer, I don't mean our institutions in Egypt, but I mean in general for media. Do people really accept what they don't like? Let me go back and say to something that Stephen just said right now, the difference, the culture difference, the differences of societies. Let me say, and I think that this is going to lead me to the idea of a freedom of press, that it is an important, that it is a need, that similar in Britain, they did a lot of effort to arrive at freedom of press, and this is our objective, to arrive at bigger ceilings or bigger limits, or when it comes to media freedom or press freedom. But there is sometimes people, we have a problem when it comes to releasing this freedom through our practices. What you were saying at the moment, the idea that I insist on a certain point of view, and we have a clear example on the social media. What I'm saying is right, and who's not with me, then he's not with me. It's become an issue of life or death. If you're with me, then you're against me. If you're not with me, then you're against me. And therefore, we have this a strong challenge that everyone is undergoing clashes all the time, and these clashes, because of they are seeing that you're either an agent, or that you are, or even if I topple a whole country, or the way I like, the way I think. Now we have some sort of extremist way of thinking, and this impacts, and that's why I'm saying freedom. The freedom of press and freedom for media is extremely important and a need. But what's more important is the societal freedom or thought freedom, how I can have enlightening and accept other people's thoughts and discuss with him, so that I can arrive at freedom in media or in press, that I would have a way to discuss anything that is against or contrary to my ideas. This is the freedom of expression and freedom of, yes, if I accept the freedom of expression and freedom of thought. But what happens is, in our media, we receive these extremist thoughts, and then we raise questions around it, and we continue in clashing all the time without being logical and realizing that these ideas, each one has his own idea, and I respect other people's thoughts, and I know how to discuss with them. This is in the region in general. And if I don't arrive at this freedom in areas where there are situations where there is no freedoms given, because the map was actually impactful. I mean, you're saying if there is insistence in areas that are actually limiting freedoms, or this isn't the word, no, this is in the region more, because let's look at the media inside the region or the press inside the region. Unfortunately, there is a lot of media channels that is based on polarization, on ethnicity. We have channels that have been classified that they follow the following ethnicity. So in the region, we already, even our media channels have been classified. Until this very day, we have Salafists, societal Salafists, if I can say that. Even in the political life, we're still saying, you are a Nasserist, so are you sad? Are you part of a Sadat's regime? We don't look where we want to go, and this is what's going to lead us to media and building a country, a whole nation. So unfortunately, the classification is based on ethnicity or other things, and this shouldn't be in the media, because if in media I'm talking as free media, I have to accept all of the different points of view. How would I accept if this channel or this means or this newspaper follows this ethnicity or that? Of course, it's very important to differentiate between the freedom of expression and the freedom of media. I think they would be accepting that, but let me go to Mr. Izzat. You have a lot of diverse experience and they're multicultural. The question would be, are there certain cripples? Okay, there are certain cripples that come from governments, from regimes, but the people who work in media, do they put their own limitations or codes to free themselves from terrorism of others or opposition? If I say the truth this way, do we put our boundaries before holding any government accountable? I wanted to go back to the map that Mr. Stephen mentioned about journalists with no boundaries. I think that dealing with a map like this, I think we're confronting a problem here, that the relationship between the media and other authorities elsewhere in the world, there's a lot of changes, or that there is a lot of discussion and debate today. If you go to Google, for example, and you see, I was trying to do some homework yesterday and see how people are talking worldwide about this interactivity between the media or authorities, legislative authority, the executive government branch, and also what's new in media. So small things that I wanted to show you, so that we all know, and we have a lot of youth from different parts of the world with us here today. To give you an example, if we talk about what's happening in Italy today, there is a law that is being drafted within the Italian Parliament on stopping any recordings, and that the journalists who will provide such will stand before a judge. Again, they're talking that this type of laws, mafia can use them to imprison journalists easily, because they can't use them and they can't do any writings based on them. And in Britain, for example, there is a law for amending to give certain rights for information, and this will stop the ability to protect journalists for their sources. And there are a lot of individuals, even in the Labour Party, because they see that there is an infringement for usage of information and data when in the British media at the moment. Yesterday also, for example, I was following the Prime Minister on India. He provided a number of tweets where he spoke about the idea of abuse of freedom of journalism, and he was requesting them to concentrate on normal citizens and not only on politics. Here, this is in a wider context, role of the media, especially when we're talking about development or when we're talking about India, a community that is changing, and also the states that Trump considers that freedom of press is something bad, and that he's always saying in his speeches that he wants to open the door in front of holding journalists liable. And a year ago I was observing the elections, and I've seen how biased the Americans were. I was in New York Times on the day of the elections, and I've seen how the media, when it converts or becomes a biased tool, it oversees reality and it becomes extremely dangerous, and the public perception falls in the falsified information and the political situation. They see social media, what happens in the changes that happen throughout the world. I think that the flow of information definitely leads to transparency and to good judgment, and that this is an issue that we all agree to. There are a lot of enhancements that are required in this area, whether here or elsewhere, and a lot of other developing countries, but also the developed countries have their own problem, and the relationship between journalism and between authority needs to be redrafted greatly. This is like what's happening in the United States and Europe, Eastern Europe. If we take another example that dealt with migration, the images of migration in the international and the Western press, there's a lot of reviews that has been conducted on ethical journalism at the moment, and I believe that there's a lot of individuals here who have participated in reviews, important reviews, when it comes to the image of a migrant in Western news. When the migrant's picture, when there is discrimination against him, there is a lot of reviews that we need to talk about. However, I still see that there is challenges that are confronting the job, not only the freedom but also professionalism, as Mr. Albert Shafiq mentioned, to let go of biasness towards something. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir. I would like to go back to Ms. Suad and ask you, we're still always a step ahead, we're always a step ahead, and we always sentence or judge that there are malpractices, but allow me to go one step back. I'd like to know what are the correct practices if we're going to talk about the media or press, that they have right for freedom and they have to obtain that. Then definitely there is a path for them to achieve such one way or the other. I'd like to ask you specifically about the code or the editorial code and how related it is to the ceiling of freedoms.
I will speak about our experience in a French institution owned by the state and funded completely by the state. We really don't need advertisements, fortunately. The budget of our institution comes from the parliament. So when we are visited by foreign visitors, especially from the Arab world, they say that you are the voice of the state because you are funded by the state. They cannot just understand that there is a huge difference between the state that funds and the state that censors or controls. Yes, in France, the public institutions, they cannot have interventions from the state, and if this happens, then the gates of hell are going to be flung open on them. And in fact, the journalists sign a code of conduct that has to do with respecting the ethics of the profession. This is why I mentioned the importance of such ethics, because journalism has to be taught in schools. Its ethics has to be taught in schools before the student becomes the bearer of the responsibility of the public opinion. The journalist should conduct his or her work professionally, which means making sure of the news, depending on the opinion and the opinion of the other. And if this is not done, then the institution is held accountable. The head of the institution will be held accountable. So it's of paramount importance that the journalists from the outset should respect this code of conduct, and that no outsiders should delve into the arena of journalism. We are not going to have some sort of surveillance on journalists on daily basis. However, within the framework of the profession, the code of conduct should be applied. We in the field of media, broadcasting from Europe to the Arab world, we are geographically so far away from the receiver, and this is why we shoulder an extra burden. And so we need to know who are they and what do they need to see in their daily life, but within the framework of utter and complete freedom. We might be jealous. Yes, but the principle here is respecting the professionality, the professionalism. A huge part of what Ms. Suad said has to do with the responsibility of the journalist or the person sending the information. The idea of the code of conduct or the code of ethics could be part of the help needed. So, Mr. Stephen, I want to ask you once more about the path to the journalist attaining more freedoms and more liberties without being a tool of destruction. In so many communities, there is some confusion about journalists receiving a great deal of freedom and his ability to maintain the truth, because just like Mr. Albert was saying, half the truth is a big lie. And so how can this be attained without the journalists being turned into tools of destruction of communities?
Journalism cannot survive unless it behaves ethically. For most of us in journalism, we are involved in a commercial organization. We're not lucky enough to be funded by the state. We have to survive. You can't survive if your audience doesn't trust you. Trust is absolutely key to this conversation. If you don't trust what you hear on the radio, if you don't trust what you read in your newspaper, you're not going to bother with it. You'll turn to something else. So this idea of codes of conduct and ethical codes, ethical editorial codes, is extremely important in bolstering the idea of freedom of the press. We need to source credible, verifiable information and pass that to the people. Why? Because news is not just a record of day-to-day events. It's the narrative of our lives. It tells us who we are. If you restrict that flow of credible and verifiable information, a nation loses its identity. It doesn't really know who it is. And more important, that nation is not understood by other nations. If you don't really understand what's happening in a particular country, you become suspicious of that country. And suspicion can lead to misunderstanding. Misunderstanding of a nation can lead to hatred. Hatred of a nation can lead to conflict. News is not just a rotor of events. It can be a peacemaker. And a nation that deprives its own people of the fresh water of true information is not only that, it's not taking its place in the world. It can't allow its people to prosper in that way. So all this comes in one full circle. Ethical behavior by journalists opens the window of not only of the rest of the world into a nation, but that nation to the rest of the world. I won't continue very much longer, but just let me say that I work in the field of ethical journalism in Britain. I run something called the Organisation of News Ombudsmen, and people like me sit in a newsroom and have the freedom to evaluate the journalism and write about the journalism to the reader. I can correct the errors of my newspaper, and the editor can't interfere with what I do. In return for that freedom, the editor clears his or her desk of all the problems that land from angry readers, angry politicians, etc. They come my way instead. That's an ethical way to try to regulate the press. I'll stop there.
Thank you for that. في الحديث عن بناء الثقة كواحدة من الأساسيات اللي بتدي الصحفي مساحات أكبر، هسأل مستر ألبرت، حضرتك كمدير لمؤسسة إعلامية إخبارية ناجحة بالتأكيد بتخضع أحيانا، أو مش هقول المثل على حضرتك، المسؤول عن مؤسسات دائما بيخضعوا لإغراء
of an institution sometimes is lured into publishing some news that are a bit sensational, which are sometimes, allow me to describe them as lying incidents or lying news. And this is compared to another path to build confidence. Of course, the institutions want to gain profit, but they also want to gain confidence. How would this be balanced? I would like to quote you and Stephen, and I would like to add that there is a path to reach the audience to create a foundation of confidence. I'm going to speak a little bit shockingly, so please bear with me. When, in order to create this confidence, we have first to respect ourselves. If such respect is not there, then there won't be any sort of confidence built between us and the people. The problem is that sometimes there is some sort of mix or confusion between gaining ads through sensational news and other issues. The audience now is aware, is sufficiently aware of what sensational news are. And they are aware also that sometimes what they see on TV screens is some sort of entertainment or an act. So that they won't trust them. The audience just gets entertained by seeing such quarrels and arguments, but they do not have confidence in these news. And this is exactly what people call acts on social media. So to create real confidence with the audience, in order for them to believe us, this will only be done through us respecting ourselves. Because if we don't respect ourselves, we won't be able to respect the audience. And if we don't make sure that the news is delivered appropriately and correctly to the audience, and if there is a fault or an error, we should apologize. If this doesn't happen, there won't be any confidence, because that's the basis and foundation of confidence. Here, communities are different, and just like what Stephen was saying, through the news, through the media, there could be a building of trust or confidence or some sort of reconciliation. I would like to give a very simple example regarding the European media after World War II. Europe has just gone out of the war. There was total destruction everywhere, and so the governments decided to control media, to supervise it in order to eradicate all the effects of this destruction, because this was at a point in time where they wanted to rebuild their states in order for the media to be really patriotic and to convey positive vibes and messages in order for these states to rebuild themselves once more. Also, France and Germany, for example, during World War II, there was a lot of hatred going on between both countries, and the media contributed in ending such hatred and in forging a new relationship between France and Germany, eradicating all forms of hatred, and it built a peace for both countries. And then France and Germany became friendly states even before the European Union was formed. And here the media, allow me to say something, please. The model or the example that you mentioned, I'm sorry if this is off topic, but each one of us heard the people before speaking about other people negatively. So you have two ways of responding to that. Either you agree and speak negatively as well, or you can respond saying that, okay, but they are good in other aspects. So that's the difference between making peace and making hatred. Can this be applied to states as well? Yes, this is what I was saying at the outset. I said that right now we are in a period of conflicts, and people perceive a difference in opinion as hatred. And I think that media plays a critical role here, because media should create intellectual outreach and awareness before we delve into the arena of freedoms and liberties, because media shoulders the responsibility of creating true enlightenment and true awareness in the community. We always speak about developmental media, and I don't want to use this word. I want to use the enlightening media adjective, because we want people to hear each other. We want people to coexist so that they can build. We need to accept different ideas so that we would turn into one that builds. So this has to be formed into a strategy, into a mechanism where media insists on unifying a community by creating real culture. Of course, we don't unify ideas and thoughts, but we're talking about a general mindset of accepting the other and of abstaining from attacking the other. Now we have reached a level where the personal privacy of a person is violated. I mean, why would someone speak about the personal life of someone through media channels? Today, our media should move beyond this phase, because violating the privacy and the personal lives of individuals should be criminalized. I'm not... and by the way, the personal life of public figures or politicians is different from the personal life of normal individuals whom I'm speaking about. Media should move beyond this phase and should take the responsibility, their enlightenment responsibility, so that the community would move to the phase of accepting the other, because we are at a point where we should be rebuilding our country just like Europe was at after World War II. Now to Mr. Izzat, before we move to the Q&A session. Mr. Izzat, there is some sort of differentiation here. We have the public awareness concept, and I think that this is a form of building the states, and also there is the politicized media. How can we differentiate between both concepts? I think that politicized media is a concept that is about to die off, because with all the informational flow throughout the world and all the social media that we see now, ends the legend or the myth of politicized media. And also regarding press and journalism, the definition of the freedom of the press is mainly about the lack of or ending the control of the state over journalism. How old is this definition? It's very old. Yes, this is true because media has been evolving. But what I'm saying here is that politicized media is no longer a strong concept. And I think this has already been discussed in Egypt before. Also tying the freedom of the press to the educational phase, because in Europe now we have countries devising courses on how to deal with fake news in schools. In more than one European country, now they have special programs that are going to be part of the school curricula to teach students and learners about how to differentiate between true news and fake news. This means that there is a general apprehension in mature societies and communities regarding the misuse of this freedom of the press. So, I believe that we are about to start a phase where there is no clear boundaries, but this is not new to us because because we are aware of the social responsibility that makes us move from to the self-censorship phase, and we need to have real media that has the confidence of the viewer or the reader. And I believe that the question that should be posed clearly here is how can we create confidence between media and the audience within the framework of what we offer, whether in Egypt or outside of Egypt, because it's really not about the state restrictions, but it's about how we can be good practitioners so that even when we package what we do professionally, we can also pose lots of issues, even if they are thorny issues, within a professional framework through which I can attract the viewer. Thank you so much for the last sentence.
And I believe that this is one of the most important questions that need to be answered. Let's start. Coordinators, can we have the mic? You already have the mic, sir. I have a word when it comes to governments in our regions. They have a huge role to play, not to leave media without giving them information. Media in our region and maybe even in Egypt, the absence of information equals the amount or a lot of rumors in the event itself. So the more there is limited information, there is a lot of rumors without as you wish, as you want. So the absence of information is something that is going to be bad for media, and we will always be facing the same thing here. I'd like to ask a point on the fake news idea, which has now become an international phenomenon. So today, what used to be something for the deficiency of information, which probably was there to defame an institution, today has become a world war between countries and between intelligence entities. We've realized this in the American elections, the final elections, the last elections, and the French as well. And fake news, a lot of fake news, which the purpose of which was to have a lot of other companies be defamed, to end them. So the state, whatever the state would be, and here I have to go back to the starting point, the role of freedom of press in building states when it comes to the ideas of false information that can actually change regimes, because they are unable, because they can't open a war whenever there is it is known that it comes from a specific country, to harm that country. The the only entity that can actually confront this information, the wrong information, is the free press that is believed inside the state and outside the state. Yesterday there was a referendum, a poll that happened in 4 countries, Britain, United States, France, Brazil, and more than 8,000 individuals were asked about their points of view about this issue of false information or false news, and 80% of them said that they trust, that their only reference is their media that they know that is trustworthy. 80% said that first they go to paper magazines, to the TV, to radio, and at the end the social media. Although we see that social media has taken the traditional traditional press, maybe this is not the trust yet, yes, and it's still to the media that is trusted. If we look around us today, the institutions, a lot of institutions have lost their audience quickly because they were biased to a certain entity, or because they became party that is biased, so they lost this trustworthiness. The audience, we should not undermine their intelligence, we should not undermine there is a number of interventions. We'll start the interventions, and some of them are questions, and then we will come up with recommendations at the end. Dina Salahuddin, Radio Masr. Excuse me, there are some of the individuals who would like to ask the question before even writing them, and also the young people who have written questions, please deliver them to the panelists. Dina Salahuddin, and I'm in Radio Masr. We agree that there is no full freedom in the media, even with the countries that always nag about freedoms. But the question that we need to pose, we're supporting media freedom. How can that occur? And how can that be a risk? And my question is to Mr. Stephen. I have another question also for Mr. Albert. Let's take one by one, Dina. Mr. Stephen.
She was asking about how we can make the freedom of press available and private without entering the economy.
I think it's a question of the people themselves and the desire of the people themselves to have a free flow of verifiable, credible information. As a citizen, you can't operate as a citizen without being informed. You can't make decisions about your life. You can't make decisions about things to buy, which government to elect. You need credible information. So it comes from you, the people. The people need to say, this is the media we want, and they need to reject the media that they don't trust, that they feel is not serving them. The market, if you like, is actually really quite a good way of producing a media that responds to its readers. In Britain, we have a very aggressive press. We're a very small country, but we have 7 daily newspapers, and each of them fight each other for the attention of their readers. Now, sometimes, of course, they overreach themselves. Of course they do, in hoping to go for circulation. But the fact is that those that don't do the job properly fail. I've seen 2 newspapers close in the last 2 years in Britain because people ultimately either don't trust them or they're finding better sources of information elsewhere. So I think it starts with you, the consumer, the citizen. You need to demand the media you want.
Mr. Albert, you mentioned that the communication apologizes if there's any mistake, so this gives him or the media the trustworthiness. Is this the only criteria, sir, or are there other criterion to... No, this is part. I said it's not the only criterion, of course, and it doesn't mean that you should make mistakes. If you allow me to say, the first criteria was, of course, how, as a journalist, as a media professional, can I respect myself and therefore deliver information that is correct, that is professional, with there's a lot of criteria, professional criteria. They're long, but the first of them is how to respect myself to be able to gain the confidence and respect of the audience as well. It has not only become, we're not only concentrating on professionalism, but there is also commercial, there's social media, there's the responses on the social media, and the vision, and the number of likes, etc., etc. So now these are the criteria, and unfortunately that's why I'm saying let's go back to the basic ones to be able to create trust with the spectator or the viewer. Khalid and I'm an Egyptian journalist. Let me go back to the title, and maybe the first the first title we had, Convincing People with Freedom, in 2017. The journalists who work in this, do you see that we as journalists have been able to convince people, convince states and individuals about the freedom of press? Have we been able to ask them to defend with us this freedom, defend this freedom, about this freedom? I just need the answer. Do you mean that have we worked on our case enough so that the societies and the governments help us? Yes, it should be ours, because the freedom is not freedom for the media only, but it's for people. It is the right of the citizens. So have the citizens now, or the governments, been convinced with that? Do they push that? Do they, if we succeeded in doing that, or if we didn't, how can we correct this path? If there is a lot of clashes and there is a deficiency in information and there's a lot of things, maybe they came with a president who's not in his right place. Maybe there's a lot of stories related to misleading information, and our ability as journalists to put people in front of realities and then leave their decision up to them. Where would the question go to? To everyone? It's a very short sentence, which is, the strong country does not fear journalism. It helps it, because journalism is a channel. It's an open channel between the citizen and the ruler. So if it is torn or it's blocked some way or the other, this channel, then the citizen will look for other means to express himself. It might be violent, it might not be suitable or not fit, but I believe that it is the benefit of all countries to give the full information, as Albert mentioned, to provide information for media, because it's at the end, it's their interest to continue to ensure the continuation of those people, because the state is a number of citizens, to ensure the open of this channel. We have not succeeded, and you can ask other journalists. See, it's a very short answer. I see that the regular citizen nowadays are everyday citizen are trying to see whether the reality, whether it is correct or not, the ones who are in the media 24 hours. So the citizens have succeeded, but we haven't. I think also that there's a lot of retreat in the information provided, whether in the written media or in electronic media, on electronic websites. I think that we are still confronted by a huge effort that needs to be exerted to become professional, and this is not only Egypt. Of course, I see that there's a lot of countries that have or face the same problem, since we have individuals guests who are from different countries. I think that we still need this leap, this has to come in line with that the people themselves would interfere, people who work in this job would interfere to ensure that there wouldn't be any journalist who does not know how to deal with information. Unfortunately, a lot of the retreat of newspapers, especially in Egypt, is due to the inability to work with information properly, and I believe that this needs a lot of training. Needs to be awareness from all of the institutions and giving more time to train the biggest number of individuals to interact with the given information. Mr. Richard, the question is, where have we succeeded or not as societies? And I think that it can be an open question in gaining societal or international societies' empathy for freedom of expression.
Nature of government. Government needs to be mature enough to realize that it needs a responsible media to help it govern its own country. It doesn't need to put restrictions in front of media. If anything, it needs to open doors to let media in to the story. We've been hearing here about possible restrictions on information supply to the media. That's very worrying to hear. The media should be able to go into any area of public life and discuss it with you, the reader, you, the consumer, you, the citizen. You have these rights. But the media needs to be professional about how it does it. And it's a problem all over the world that we have lots of very committed people who actually aren't particularly professional about what they do and how they do it. And that gives the media a bad name, gets us into trouble. So it's a question of, again, I come back to the circle idea of education at school about what the media is and what it means to be part of the media, what it is to consume the media, and then education, if you wish to go into this profession, in how to handle information, how to handle it responsibly, how to present to your readers credible, verifiable news. So to me, it seems that none of us actually have the answer to this, but all of us have got things that we can contribute from all nations into the idea of how a free press actually operates.
Thank you. أنا طبعا في مشاركات كثيرة، استأذنكم بس أخذ مداخلة من أو مشاركة من أحد الشباب اللي بيقول
saying, and the question is to Mr. Stephen. He's asking, I apologize if there's repetition in questions, so please allow me to just say the questions, group them together. Muhammad Sami can say his question, and there is also a similar meaning about the methodology of the study that Mr. Stephen has spoken about. Mr. Ahmed, you asked about the methodology? Anyone? Mr. Ahmed, Muhammad, or you? One of you can ask a question. It's the same question, so...
The studies about the press freedom, more the statistics and the relation between the culture of this country and the results. I want to know more details, more further details.
Okay, I've got here an explanation as to how that map is arrived at. May I read it to you? It seems the best way to try to explain how it's arrived at. The ranking of the nations has been carried out since 2002 every year, and has become an important tool in the principle of the emulation between states. And it's a point of reference for the United Nations and the World Bank, and politicians don't like it. The index ranks 180 countries according to the level of freedom available to journalists. It's a snapshot of the media freedom situation based on an evaluation of pluralism, independence of the media, the quality of the legislation in that country, and the safety of journalists in each country. It does not rank public policies, even if governments obviously have a major impact on their country's ranking. Nor is it an indicator of the quality of the journalism in that country. I think that's an important point. the degree of freedom available to journalists in 180 countries is determined by pooling the responses of experts to a questionnaire that I mentioned earlier, devised by this organization called Reporters Without Borders. So that goes out in 20 different languages around the world. And it's a study that tries mostly to establish the safety of journalists, actually. It's more to do with the safety of those of us who work in this trade, which of course is all bound up with the idea of freedom. So it's again, I go back to it's the ownership of the media in that country, pluralism, the independence of that media, what degree of independence does it enjoy, the quality of the laws within that country around freedom of the press, and the safety of journalists in each country.
Thank you, Mr. كان في أستاذ علاء، أستاذ سحر، المايك يا شباب. عقبال ما المايك يجي لنا هنا عند أستاذ سحر أو أستاذ علاء. عقبال ما المايك يجي لنا خليني أقول للزميلة سارة علام إنه بتسأل نفس السؤال بتاع دينا، أعتقد إنه كتب لها، أو سارة علام قالت ما.
سارة علام, what are the role, the limitation of known or to know information and national security? In the name of God, most gracious, most merciful, Raed Ghadrifi, the head of one of the newspapers. My question is to Mr. Izzat. The idea of the appearance, you spoke about the directed media. This is the idea of new forms of ownership in Egyptian newspapers. This in line with the your idea. The second question is to Mr. Albert. What would Mr. Albert do? You spoke about what would you do with them every day on your screen. Thank you very much. Very nice question. What do you do, Mr. Albert? I see that the ending of this media, the general media, has to move to something that is more professional. So, for example, in the case of Egypt, the TV, I believe that we have to reconsider that the TV, because this was the means, this is the closest to confront even wrong or falsified information, and the flows of media, wrong media, that there should be one form of media that can actually correct everything, similar to what we have in other countries. If you look at BBS in the States, they provide content, awareness, educational, the content that I believe plays an important role even in the idea of solidarity and providing different visions of politics. BBC plays a role, although we have a lot of comments on their performance in the way they tackle certain issues of the Middle East. But what I mean is that the directed media needs to end the idea that it provides only one form of media for the spectator or for the reader. I think that this is not acceptable anymore, and this was the meaning that I wanted to stipulate. And I think that the ownership methods or shapes are different, and this change gives non-stability. The change of ownership, or the owner moving from one hand to the other, I think that this gives no unification of the message that is being delivered, and this makes a lot of turbulence. I've seen a lot of things happen in the area. There's going to be a lot of changes in our region as well due to the changes in politics. I think that this is going to also change the message that will be provided over the coming period. We have to maybe we have the right to develop ourselves as well remotely from other things that are owned by non-Egyptians, for example. To respond to your question, but there's a huge difference between the ideas around a certain perspective, my perspective and your perspective, and this is what I was talking about, and between performance. Because the issue is that if I'm performing somehow and I have a loud voice, or I'm talking to C class or A class or B class, that we're talking about performance with a different media way, that and not that I'm against you or that you're against me, that this is the idea that we're always talking about, but the idea of performance, which is different, and this performance is similar to any writer writing one way and the other writing another way. This talks to A class, C class, B class, and each class, social class within the society has their own way that you talk with. Someone has a loud voice, a projecting voice, and he uses a lot of terms because this is what a lot of people like. And there's someone else who shouts and someone else who talks, I apologize, in maybe less than A and B class way of thinking, but because he's talking to a different class of people. And we have a lot of examples for those individuals, and this is a diversity of performance, not in a specific inclination, because I'm against the presence of such extremism in ideas, and to accept others or tolerate others. This is a totally different story. To keep time, we will try to have questions faster and also answers faster. Thank you. I had a question from Ms. Marina Al-Mosri.
Microphone, please. Which belongs to the recreational or entertainment or not? I'm sorry, I did not hear the question. Mrs. Marina's question is directed to Mr. Albert Shafiq. I have nothing to do with the recreational or entertainment. The comedy media or the comedy media is part of the media. Yes, it is very important. The sarcastic media, the sarcasm, it should be there. It should be presented in our media outlets. It is very important. But sarcasm here is not. There is a difference between being sarcastic towards the human being or being sarcasm from the situations in general. There's a difference. I want to add a very small point on what Mr. Albert just mentioned, and also to Stephen about education, educating journalists. You cannot change your rhetorics only because you are speaking to people who are less educated. You cannot get down to them. Your role as a journalist, as a well-educated journalist, is to carry the responsibility of raising the awareness, of informing the people. You must enjoy a minimum decency, responsibility in your rhetorics. You shouldn't allow yourself to get down to the level of less educated people, because they won't so. They will listen to you. You have to take them up. You have to raise their awareness. You have to educate them. They will follow you up. I'm speaking about the performance. I'm adding to what you said. Yes, I agree with you when it comes to the information, but I'm speaking about the performance in general. Mrs. Sahar Al-Gaara, a journalist. The title of the seminar should have been limited to how to define the freedom, because I believe that it is a dilemma here in the Arab world. The confusion, the misinformation, the misconcepts we are having about the term freedom. Number two, we are speaking all the time on more restrictions and more limits. Mr. Stephen gave some examples.
against more freedoms we are seeing in France, for example. In between, we are lost. We are not there or here. Dr. Dea, the head of the information service, who used to be this chair of the syndicate of the journalists. We have a crisis or problems with the dissemination of information and with imprisonment of journalists. There should be objective evaluation. There was an incident, and for full 12 hours, we couldn't get a reliable source of information. We are doing our messages, we are doing our jobs, and we are crippled by the lack of information. All the time we are speaking about governments crippling, restricting, or giving freedoms, or formulating, or drafting, while the people of the profession are absent. While we have unions, syndicates, we have codes of ethics, codes of conduct. This is the same idea of Mr. Khaled, the right to have freedom. It is vital here that people who are concerned with the profession, who need requalification and training and so on and so forth, they should enjoy a full opportunity to express their needs and their requirements. A seminar on the freedom of press in light of laws that allow imprisonment of journalists, this is contradiction. Mrs. Sahar, we are speaking generally, not about a given country. This is an opinion or a question, Mrs. Sahar? It's a comment. Good afternoon. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting us to this excellent seminar, and many thanks to all the panelists for all what they mentioned. I agree with every single word uttered. I have a comment. I will refer to Stephen. Stephen mentioned that the history of his newspaper dates back to 226 years ago. Mr. Ibrahim here, his newspaper dates back to 140 years ago. The very same year of the establishment of newspaper of Mr. Stevens, Britain was a kingdom, a huge kingdom, a huge empire, and Mr. Ibrahim's newspaper was established in a country colonized by Britain, by this empire. And this is very important. This is fundamental. Today we are speaking about report of Reporters Without Boundaries. And this report is colored, red, white, black. Many people do not know that India, for example, this India, which ranks in a very important position as a democratic country, it has a very bad ranking on this report of Reporters Without Borders. So do the United States and the other democratic countries. This takes us to the methodology of this report. Mr. Stephens, you mentioned the standards, the criteria, but you did not say how. 14 partner organizations to Reporters Without Borders around the globe, with 130 reporters of Reporters Without Borders, are defining, according to the criteria, the ranking. I will give you a story, an incident related to what Mrs. Sahar just mentioned. In 2014, there were many reports, 15 reports on freedom of press from the Reporters Without Borders and other organizations as well. For 2 years, in the syndicate of journalism, no single organization interested in the freedom of press came to my office. By coincidence, the Organization of Protection of Journalists in New York came to me to get some information, and they were surprised that this is the very first visit by an NGO working in the freedom of press to the biggest and most ancient syndicate of journalists in the Middle East. I am not being I'm not being skeptic about the reports, but I'm being skeptic about the methodology. Results could be close to the real situation as we see and as we depict. But the situation takes us back to the start, when the Observers was established and when Al-Ahram was established. What was the situation of Britain and what was the situation of Egypt? This takes us back to the current situation. This is not a justification. This is not a beautification of the situation. We are going through a very hard situation. No one ever worked on the ancient, contemporary or modern history of Egypt have ever seen time similar to the years since 2011 until now. We are going through major changes. This is very much close to the first French Revolution, which extended in Europe till 1840. 70 years of consecutive revolutions that resulted in having the Observer. We are not asking you to wait for 70 years. We are asking for time. If we are speaking about journalism as being part of the society, part of the context, the whole context is not yet stable. Yes, there are violations against the press in Egypt. I know this. I am responsible. I am an official. And I used to say this while I'm chairing the syndicate of journalists. There is lack of information. Definitely, we are suffering from this. Yet, on the other side, there are indicators that we need to notice and read. There is an article in New York Times for their correspondents in Cairo. Read about what he sees in this country, what he sees in this conference. This is not the first report. This is not the first article. It is 100+ reports from the same newspapers. Read this article, please. We are having huge changes, and officially we have 1,200 foreign correspondents. This is an indicator. It is an indicator to the freedom of press. For a full decade, 10 years, no single correspondent have been kicked out of Egypt except for 5 correspondents. They have been kicked out Egypt in a single incident all once. In the last 4 years, we have more and more indicators that are quite positive. We have quantitative increase rather than qualitative, but let's speak of numbers. In the Egyptian media, we are having increase in the newspapers that have been licensed after 2014. 18% increase in the number of newspapers that are being officially published.
In the channels, it depends on the number, the official numbers that we have, that is approximately 22% in the same years, and the number of journalists as well, we have an increase. The number of members in the syndicate have increased 25%. Other than thousands who are not part, there is a new one that is being established in the first time in the history of this country. Now we've started lately. Let me go back to the Constitution. I am honored to be amongst the number of one of the 50 people who wrote the Constitution. There is an article, I don't think, no, I'm sure that it is there in the French Constitution, and the United States, there is no Constitution, which is the non-legitimacy of stopping or seizing license or ending the operation of any media tool without, even if with a judicial decision. We're talking about a constitution maybe that has not been applied yet, including the imprisonment of journalists. It hinders, it stops the journalists. The law is there, has not been changed yet, but the court can go back to the Constitution and apply the Constitution's articles, and the Parliament can provide. So the freedom of journalists at the end of the day and the press is an issue that is not properly accorded. And thank you very much for the beginning. Can we link between the development, the economical development, and the development of citizens without media development? As a researcher, I'm speaking here. It's impossible. China is number 2 or 3 in the world today. The freedom of media is number 178, just before the end. 3 countries. So our final question, Egypt, what is it looking for today? Allow me to ask the question to be broader than this. Egypt, what is it seeking now? More freedom for the press? More stable citizen? More educated people? A citizen that is capable, who can have health care against virus C, for example. The experiences, there are a lot of countries that have chosen their paths, because China has already chosen, India has also chosen. Both countries are more than a billion, and they've been included. Now, what's the first priority? Are we looking an index? Are we looking for an index that we need to develop on? Or are people doing observers and Ahram at the same time? This is occupied and this is occupied. Which should we look for? I believe that this is a question, this is a difficult question, and I think someone else needs to answer it. Thank you very much, Mr. Dia. Thank you. We will take a number of recommendations. Finally, if anyone has a recommendation, and of course we will go back to the participants in the panel to come up with final recommendations to come to free journalism and free media. If it's a question, I'm going to apologize. We don't have time for it anymore. Yes, okay. Take us to the recommendations. Lead us. Dr. Yasser Abdelaziz, you have to prepare yourself because the mic's on its way to you. Good afternoon, Ahmed Badr. And I'm an Egyptian journalist, and I would like to ask if the map was correct. I want Mr. Stephen to tell me what are the steps that Egypt can undertake not to arrive at white but only orange. And how many years do we need to apply that if we're saying that the 2018's president can provide in his platform something for freedom of media? Can you tell us steps? Thank you very much. This question was asked before.
This is the World Youth Forum. It's not the Egyptian Youth Forum. We're not just here to talk about Egypt. I put that map on the wall because I thought it showed the world. There are many people in this room from many, many nations who all have concerns about the freedom of the press in their own nation. We're not just here to talk about Egypt. And I was quite careful not to talk about Egypt. It was you who started talking about Egypt. However, what does Egypt do? Egypt listens, which is what it's doing. This is what it's marvelous at. You know, here we are in a world forum. There are people in this room with ideas. Egypt should listen and look and avoid the problems of a lot of the world they've got to get itself into. But look around and look at the press that you admire in the world. Look at the press that you admire. Look at the press that you perhaps reach to outside Egypt. And see how that might be emulated in this country. Definitely you need better sources of information. You need to have a clear understanding from your government that you are not there to continually criticize it, but you are there to provide some critical analysis sometimes of how a nation works, because that's how nations do work. They work by talking to each other, by listening to each other, by disagreeing. There's nothing wrong with disagreeing with people. So those would be my principal points. But please, can we try to remember that we are talking about the world and not just this lovely country. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stephen. So أنا نعتبر أن دي أول واحدة من التوصيات، الوصول إلى حرية الصحافة عن طريق الاستماع إلى الداخل.
Listening internally and overseeing other experiences and respecting diversities or differences. Let's take another recommendation from Mr. Izzat. I think I see that what does the media change in the society? It affects knowledge, it affects directions, it affects political perspectives. So I think that our role is greater to be played over the coming period, because it needs to be positive in the society. We need to be innovative, and at the same time to be concerned with the information aspect. I think that these are the tools that need to be provided or taken into consideration. And if we have a title here in this session, why why press freedom is important, or why does it matter, then I think that the responsibility, the societal responsibility, is important. And then the dark ideas and this is that need to be fought, and I think that this is also very important. And to stop running after news, and I think that this is also no longer possible. Thank you very much. Enlightenment, I think. As I said everything that I wanted to say. However, allow me to say again, freedom of information dissemination. Media without information, then there's no media. The right of the journalist to obtain, yes, to the furthest extent, otherwise we will be only there to listen to rumors and everything that is happening, whether on social media or otherwise. Information is important because there's no media without information. More space for information to be delivered to journalists and then be delivered to people, because we are in this forum for youth, as has been said before me, World Youth Forum. I was thinking about something that would probably benefit everyone. I believe that it's possible to include the culture of dialogue, of discussion in the scholastic years, students, and education, or the freedom of press would become known. So the freedom of people, of points of view, yes, and discussion as well, dialogue, because that is the path for peace. I read a joke about journalism. He told his son shush. He told his wife shut up, because he was writing an article about freedom of speech. Let me take 2 or 3 more recommendations from the floor. Dr. Yasser. I apologize, I have not been able to hear the speaker. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Hafiz, and I'm the editor of Akhir Sa'a, editor-in-chief. I thank you very much for all of the speakers. I just wanted to counter one of the words that were said, not to seek information or any unifying the backbone of information or media. Sir, what I mean is what happens in the media, the fake news. What I was talking about was the fake news. Anyway, since we're talking about recommendations, so when I'm saying about a journalist who was capable of first delivering piece of information, the idea should have been a freedom of media, not freedom of press only. And all of my colleagues probably intertwined between both in electronic channels as well, so we needed to talk about media, not press only. The recommendation is that I want a commitment from all of those who work in media with codes of ethics that would be available in channels, available in newspapers, available in magazines, as have been mentioned by Mr. Dia. that they as soon with notification, so you can issue a newspaper as soon as you notify, and that's a given right. While notification, he needs to commit with a code of ethics that he has included in addition to the code of press. So of freedom, I don't see that freedom is a target. It needs to be a means to achieve everything that Mr. Diya said. We need development, we need stability, we need security, we need economical development, we need all of this. This is going to be through our practice of freedom. Practicing of freedom, there needs to be codes of ethics for everyone to abide by, to commit to, everyone working in this area. Thank you very much. And let me rephrase, so that the freedom would be a means to build nations and build awareness, and also to commit to codes of ethics. Thank you very much for this session. I've really benefited and enjoyed your participation. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.